Audio Renaissance presents New Spring by Robert Jordan. Read for you by Kate Redding and Michael Kramer.
Chapter 1. The Hook. A cold wind gusted through the night across the snow-covered land where men had been killing one another for the past 3 days. The air was crisp, if not so icy as Lan expected for this time of year. It was still cold enough for his steel breastplate to carry the chill through his coat, and his breath to mist in front of his face when the wind did not whip it away. The blackness in the sky was just beginning to fade, the thousands of stars, like the thick scattered dust of diamonds, slowly dimming. The fat sickle of the moon hung low, giving barely light to make out the silhouettes of the men guarding the fireless camp in the sprawling copse of oak and leatherleaf. Fires would have given them away to the Aiel. He had fought the Aiel long before this war began, on the Shienaran marches, a matter of duty to friends. Aiel men were bad enough in daylight. Facing them in the night was as close to staking your life on the toss of a coin as made no difference. Of course, sometimes they found you without fires. Resting a gauntleted hand on his sword in its scabbard, he pulled his cloak back around himself and continued his round of the sentries through calf-deep snow. It was an ancient sword, made with the one power before the breaking of the world, during the War of the Shadow, when the Dark One had touched the world for a time. Only legends remained of that age, except perhaps for what the Aes Sedai might know, yet the blade was hard fact. It could not be broken, and never needed sharpening. The hilt had been replaced countless times over the long centuries, but not even tarnish could touch the blade. Once, it had been the sword of Malkieri kings. The next sentry he came to, a short, stocky fellow in a long, dark cloak, was leaning back against the trunk of a heavy-limbed oak, his head slumped on his chest. Lan touched the sentry's shoulder, and the man jerked upright, almost dropping the horn and sinew horsebow gripped in his gloved hands. The hood of his cloak slid back, revealing his conical steel helmet for an instant, before he hastily pulled the cowl up again. In the pale moonlight, Lan could not make out the man's face behind the vertical bars of his face guard, but he knew him. Lan's own helmet was open in the style of dead Malkier, supporting a steel crescent moon above his forehead. "I wasn't sleeping, my lord," the fellow said quickly. "Just resting a moment." A copper-skinned Domani, he sounded embarrassed, and rightly so. This was not his first battle, or even his first war. "An Aiel would have wakened you by slitting your throat, or putting a spear through your heart, Basram," Lan said in a quiet voice. Men listened closer to calm tones, then to the loudest shouts, so long as firmness and certainty accompanied the calm. "Maybe it will be better without the temptation of the tree so near." He refrained from adding that even if the Aiel did not kill him, the man risked frostbite standing in one place too long. Basram knew that. Winters were nearly as cold in Arad Doman as in the borderlands. Mumbling an apology, the Domani respectfully touched his helmet and moved 3 paces out from the tree. He held himself erect now and peered into the darkness. He shifted his feet, too, guarding against blackened toes. Rumor said Aes Sedai were offering healing closer to the river, injuries and sickness gone as if they had never been. But without that, amputation was the usual way to stop a man losing his feet to black rot, and maybe his legs as well. In any case, it was best to avoid becoming involved with Aes Sedai more than absolutely necessary. Years later, you could find one of them had tied strings to you just in case you might have need. Aes Sedai thought far ahead, and seldom seemed to care who they used in their schemes or how. That was one reason Lan avoided them. How long would Basram's renewed alertness last? Lan wished he had the answer, but there was no point in taking the Domani to task further. All of the men he commanded were bone-weary. Like every man in the army of the grandly named Great Coalition, sometimes it was called the Grand Coalition, or the Grand Alliance, or half a dozen other things, some worse than uncomplimentary. Likely every last man was near exhaustion. A battle was hot work, snow or no snow, and tiring. Muscles could knot from tension even when they had the chance to stop for a time, and the last few days had offered small chance to stop very long. The camp held well over 300 men, a full quarter of them on guard at any given time. Against Aiel, Lan wanted as many eyes as he could manage. And before he had gone another 200 paces, he had had to wake 3 more, one asleep on his feet without any support at all. Jayem's head was up and his eyes open. That was a trick some soldiers learned, especially old soldiers like Jayem. Cutting off the gray-bearded man's protests that he could not have been asleep, not standing up straight, Lan promised to let Jayem's friends know if he found him sleeping again. Jayem's mouth hung open for a moment. Then he swallowed hard. "Won't happen again, my lord. The light sear my soul if it does." He sounded sincere to his bones. Some men would have been afraid that their friends would rub them senseless for putting the rest in danger, but given the company Jayem kept, more likely he dreaded the humiliation of having been caught. As Lan walked on, he found himself chuckling. He seldom laughed, and it was a fool thing to laugh over, but laughter was better than worrying over what he could not change, such as weary men drowsing on guard. As well worry about death. What could not be changed must be endured. Abruptly he stopped and raised his voice. "Bukama, why are you sneaking about? You've been following me since I woke." A startled grunt came from behind him. Doubtless Bukama had thought he was being silent, and in truth, very few men would have heard the faint crunching of his boots in the snow, yet he should have known Lan would. After all, he had been one of Lan's teachers, and one of the first lessons had been to be aware of his surroundings at all times, even in his sleep. Not an easy lesson for a boy to learn, but only the dead could afford oblivion. The oblivious soon became the dead, in the blight beyond the borderlands. "I've been watching your back," Bukama announced gruffly, striding up to join him. "One of those black-veiled Aiel dark friends could sneak in and cut your throat for all the care you're taking. Have you forgotten everything I taught you?" Bluff and broad, Bukama was almost as tall as he, taller than most men, and wearing a Malkieri helmet without a crest, though he had the right to one. He had more concern for his duties than his rights, which was proper, but Lan wished he would not spurn his rights so completely. When the nation of Malkir died, 20 men had been given the task of carrying the infant Lan Mandragoran to safety. Only 5 had survived that journey, to raise Lan from the cradle and train him, and Bukama was the last left alive. His hair was solid gray now, worn cut at the shoulder as tradition required, but his back was straight, his arms hard, his blue eyes clear and keen. Tradition infused Bukama. A thin braided leather cord held his hair back, resting in the permanent groove across his forehead it had made over the years. Few men still wore the Hadori. Lan did. He would die wearing it, and go into the ground wearing that and nothing else, if there was anyone to bury him where he died. He glanced north, toward his distant home. Most people would have thought it a strange place to call home, but he had felt the pull of it ever since he came south. "I remembered enough to hear you," he replied. There was too little light to make out Bukama's weathered face, yet he knew it wore a glower. He could not recall seeing any other expression from his friend and teacher, even when he spoke praise. Bukama was steel, clothed in flesh. Steel his will, duty his soul. "Do you still believe the Aiel are pledged to the Dark One?" The other man made a sign to ward off evil, as if Lan had spoken the Dark One's true name, Shaitan. They had both seen the misfortune that followed speaking that name aloud, and Bukama was one of those who believed that merely thinking it drew the Dark One's attention. "The Dark One and all the Forsaken are bound in Sheol Gul," Lan recited the catechism in his head. "Bound by the Creator at the moment of creation. May we shelter safe beneath the light in the Creator's hand." He did not believe thinking that name was enough, but better safe than sorry when it came to the shadow. "If they aren't, then why are we here?" Bukama said sourly. And surprisingly. He liked to grumble, but always about inconsequential things or prospects for the future, never the present. "I gave my word to stay until the end," Lan replied mildly. Bukama scrubbed at his nose. His grunt might have been abashed this time. It was hard to be sure. Another of his lessons had been that a man's word must be as good as an oath sworn beneath the light, or it was no good at all. The Aiel had indeed seemed like a horde of dark friends when they suddenly spilled across the immense mountain range called the Spine of the World. They had burned the great city of Cairhien, ravaged the nation of Cairhien, and, in the 2 years since, had fought through Tyr and then Andor before reaching these killing fields outside the huge island city of Tar Valon. In all the years since the nations of the present day had been carved out of Arthur Hawkwing's empire, the Aiel had never before left the desert called the Waste. They might have invaded before that, no one could be sure, except maybe the Aes Sedai in Tar Valon, but as so often with the women of the White Tower, they were not saying. What Aes Sedai knew, they held close, and doled out by dribbles and drops when and if they chose. In the world outside of Tar Valon, though, many men had claimed to see a pattern. 1,000 years had passed between the breaking of the world and the Trolloc Wars, or so most historians said. Those wars had destroyed the nations that existed then, and no one doubted that the Dark One's hand had been behind them, imprisoned or not, as surely as it had been behind the War of the Shadow, and the breaking, and the end of the Age of Legends. 1,000 years from the Trolloc Wars until Hawkwing built an empire, and that too was destroyed after his death, in the War of the 100 Years. Some historians said they saw the Dark One's hand in that war too. And now, close enough to 1,000 years after Hawkwing's empire died, the Aiel came, burning and killing. It had to be a pattern. Surely the Dark One must have directed them. Lan would never have come south if he had not believed that. He no longer did, but he had given his word. He wriggled his toes in his turned-down boots. Whether or not it was as cold as he was used to, iciness burrowed into your feet if you stood too long in one place in snow. "Let's walk," he said. "I don't doubt I'll have to wake a dozen more men, if not 2, and make another round to wake others." Before they could take a step, however, a sound brought them up short and alert, the sound of a horse walking in the snow. Lan's hand drifted to his sword hilt, half-consciously easing the blade in its sheath. A faint rasp of steel on leather came from Bukama doing the same. Neither feared an attack. Aiel rode only at great need, and reluctantly even then. But a lone horseman at this hour had to be a messenger, and messengers rarely brought good news these days, especially not in the night. Horse and rider materialized out of the darkness following a lean man afoot, one of the sentries by the horsebow he carried. The horse had the arched neck of good Tyran bloodstock, and the rider was plainly from Tyr as well. For one thing, the scent of roses came ahead of him on the wind, from the oils glistening on his pointed beard, and only Tyrans were fool enough to wear scent, as if the Aiel had no noses. Besides, no one else wore those helmets, with a high ridge across the top and a rim that cast the man's narrow face in shadow. A single short white plume on the helmet marked him an officer, an odd choice for a messenger, albeit an officer of low rank. He huddled in his high-cantled saddle and held his dark cloak tightly around him. He seemed to be shivering. Tyr lay far to the south. On the coast of Tyr it never snowed so much as a single flake. Lan had never quite believed that, whatever he had read, until he had seen it for himself. "Here he is, my lord," the sentry said in a hoarse voice. A grizzled Saldaean named Rakim. He had received that voice a year back, along with a ragged scar that he liked to show off when drinking, from an Aiel arrow in the throat. Rakim considered himself lucky to be alive, and he was. Unfortunately, he also believed that having cheated death once, he would continue to do so. He took chances, and even when not drinking he boasted about his luck, a fool thing to do. There was no point to taunting fate. "Lord Mandragoran." The rider drew rein in front of Lan and Bukama. Remaining in his saddle, he eyed them uncertainly, no doubt because their armor was unadorned, their coats and cloaks plain wool and somewhat worn. A little embroidery was a fine thing, but some southern men decked themselves out like tapestries. Likely under his cloak, the Tyran wore a gilded breastplate and a silk satin coat striped in his house colors. His high boots were certainly embroidered in scroll-work that shone in the moonlight with the glitter of silver. In any case, the man went on with barely a pause for breath. The light burned my soul. I was sure you were the closest, but I was beginning to think I'd never find you. Lord Morris is following about 500 or 600 Aiel with 600 of his armsmen." He shook his head slightly. "Odd thing is, they're heading east, away from the river. At any rate, the snow slows them as much as it does us, and Lord Morris thinks if you can place an anvil on that ridgeline they call the Hook, he can take them from behind with a hammer. Lord Morris doubts they can reach it before first light." Lan's mouth tightened. Some of these Southlanders had peculiar notions of polite behavior, not dismounting before he spoke, not naming himself. As a guest he should have named himself first. Now Lan could not withhold sounding boastful. The fellow had failed to even offer his lord's compliments or good wishes, and he seemed to think that they did not know that east would be away from the river Aranon. Perhaps that was just carelessness in speech, but the rest was rudeness. Bukama had not moved, yet Lan laid a hand on his sword arm anyway. His oldest friend could be touchy. The Hook lay a good league from the camp, and the night was failing, but he nodded. "Inform Lord Imaris that I will be there by first light," he told the horseman. The name Imaris was unfamiliar, but the army was so large, near 200,000 men representing more than a dozen nations, plus tower guards from Tarvalon, and even a contingent of the Children of the Light, that it was impossible to know above a handful of names. "Bukama, rouse the men." Bukama grunted, savagely this time, and with a gesture for Rakim to follow, stalked away into the camp, his voice rising as he went. "Wake and saddle! We ride! Wake and saddle!" "Ride hard," the nameless tyrant said, with at least a hint of command in his voice. "Lord Imaris would regret riding against those Aiel without an anvil in place." He seemed to be implying that Lan would regret this Imaris's regretting. Lan formed the image of a flame in his mind, and fed emotion into it, not anger alone, but everything, every scrap, until it seemed that he floated in emptiness. After years of practice, achieving Kodi, the oneness, needed less than a heartbeat. Thought and his own body grew distant, but in this state he became one with the ground beneath his feet, one with the night, with the sword he would not use on this mannerless fool. "I said that I would be there," he said levelly. "What I say, I do." He no longer wished to know the man's name. The tyrant offered him a curt bow from his saddle, turned his horse, and booted the animal to a quick trot. Lan held the Kodi a moment longer to be sure his emotions were firmly under control. It was beyond unwise to enter battle angry. Anger narrowed the vision and made for foolish choices. How had that fellow managed to stay alive this long? In the borderlands, he would have sparked a dozen duels in a day. Only when Lan was sure that he was calm, almost as cool as if he were still wrapped in the oneness, did he turn. Summoning the tyrant's shadowed face brought no anger with it. Good. By the time he reached the center of the camp among the trees, it would have seemed a kicked ant-heap to most men. To one who knew, it was ordered activity and almost silent. No wasted motion or breath. There were no tents to be struck, since pack animals would have been an encumbrance when it came to fighting. Some men were already on their horses, breastplates buckled in place, helmets on their heads, and in their hands lances tipped with a foot or more of steel. Nearly all of the rest were tightening saddle girths or fastening leather-cased horse bows and full quivers behind the tall cantles of their saddles. The slow had died in the first year fighting the Aiel. Most now were Saldaeans and Kandori, the rest Domani. Some Malkieri had come south, but Lan would not lead them, not even here. Bukama rode with him, but he did not follow. Bukama met him carrying a lance and leading his yellow-roan gelding sun-lance, followed by a beardless youth named Kennyadrin, who was carefully leading Lan's cat-dancer. The bay stallion was only half-trained, but Kennyadrin was well advised to take care. Even a half-trained warhorse was a formidable weapon. Of course, the Kandori was not as innocent as his fresh face suggested. An efficient and experienced soldier, an archer of rare skill, he was a cheerful killer who often laughed while he fought. He was smiling now, at the prospect of fighting to come. Catdancer tossed his head, also impatient. Whatever Caniadron's experience, Lan checked Catdancer's saddle girths carefully before taking the reins. A loose girth could kill as quickly as a spear thrust. "I told them what we're about this morning," Bukama muttered after Caniadron had headed off to his own mount. "But with these Aiel, an anvil can turn into a pincushion if the hammer is slow in coming." He never grumbled in front of the men, just to Lan. "And the hammer can become a pincushion if it strikes with no anvil in place," Lan replied, swinging into the saddle. The sky was plainly gray now. Still a dark gray, but only a scattered handful of stars remained. "We will have to ride hard to reach the hook before first light." He raised his voice. "Mount!" Ride hard they did, cantering half a mile, then trotting, then leading the animals by the reins at a fast walk before mounting to begin over. In stories, men galloped for 10 miles, 20. But even without snow, to gallop the whole 4 or 5 miles would have lamed half the horses and winded the rest long before reaching the hook. The silence of the fading night was broken only by the crunch of hooves or boots in the snow crust, the creak of saddle leather, and sometimes the muttered curses of men who caught a toe on a hidden stone. No one wasted breath on complaints or talk. They had all done this often, and men and horses hit an easy rhythm that covered ground quickly. The land around Tar Valon was rolling plain for the most part, dotted with widely spaced copses and thickets, few large, but all thick with darkness. Large or small, Lan eyed those clumps of trees carefully as he led his men past, and he kept the column well away. Aiel were very good at using whatever cover they could find, places where most men would be sure a dog could not hide, and very good at springing ambushes. Nothing stirred, though. For all his eyes could see, the band he led could have been the only living men in the world. The hoot of an owl was the only sound he heard that they did not make. The sky in the east was a much paler gray by the time the low ridge called the Hook came into sight. Well under a mile in length, the treeless crest rose little more than 40 feet above the surrounding ground, but any elevation gave some advantage in defense. The name came from the way the northern end curved back toward the south, a feature plainly visible as he arranged his men in a long line along the top of the ridge to either side of him. The light was definitely growing. To the west he thought he could make out the pale bulk of the White Tower itself, rising in the center of Tar Valon, some 3 leagues distant. The tower was the tallest structure in the known world, yet it was overshadowed by the bulk of the lone mountain that rose out of the plains beyond the city, on the other side of the river. That was clear enough when there was any light at all. In the deepest night you could see it blocking the stars. Dragon Mount would have been a giant in the spine of the world, but there on the plain it was monstrous, piercing the clouds and rising taller. Higher above the clouds than most mountains were below, its broken peak always emitted a streamer of smoke. A symbol of hope and despair, a mountain of prophecy. Glancing at it, Bukama made another sign against evil. No one wanted that prophecy fulfilled, but it would be, of course, one day. From the ridgeline, gentle rolling ground ran more than a mile to the west to one of the larger thickets, half a league wide. 3 trampled paths crisscrossed the snow between, where large numbers of horses or men afoot had passed. Without going closer, it was impossible to say who had made them, Aiel or men of the so-called coalition, only that they had been made since the snowfall stopped, late 2 days ago. There was no sign of Aiel yet, but if they had not changed direction, which was always possible, they could appear out of those trees any moment. Without waiting for Lan's order, men drove their lances point down into the ground beneath the snow, where they could be snatched up again easily at need. Uncasing their horse bows, they pulled arrows from their quivers and nocked them, but did not draw. Only newlings thought they could hold a drawn bow for long. Lan alone carried no bow. His duty was to direct the fight, not to select targets. The bow was the preferred weapon against the Aiel, though many Southlanders disdained it. Imaris and his Tyrans would ride straight into the Aiel with their lances and swords. There were times when that was the only way, but it was foolish to lose men needlessly before you must, and as surely as peaches were poison, you did lose men in close quarters with Aiel. He had no fear that the Aiel would turn aside on seeing them. They were not wild fighters, no matter what some said. They refused battle when the odds were too great. But 600 Aiel would see the numbers as just right. They would be facing fewer than 400, although placed on the high ground. They would rush forward to attack and be met with a hail of arrows. A good horsebow could kill a man at 300 paces and wound at 4, if the man drawing it had the skill. That was a long corridor of steel for the Aiel to run. Unfortunately, they carried bows made of horn and sinew too, just as effective as the horsebows. The worst would be if the Aiel stood and exchanged arrows. Both sides would lose men, however quickly Imaris arrived. Best would be if the Aiel decided to close. A running man could not shoot a bow with any accuracy. At least it would be best if Imaris was not behind time. Then the Aiel might try for the flanks, especially if they knew they were being followed, and that would kick open the hornet's nest. Either way, when Imaris struck them from the rear, Lan would gather the lances and ride down. In essence, that was the hammer and anvil. One forced to hold the Aiel in place until the other struck it, then both closing in. A simple tactic, but effective. Most effective tactics were simple. Even the pig-headed Cairhienin had learned to use it. A good many Altarans and Mirandians had died because they refused to learn. Grayness welled into light. The sun would be peeking over the horizon behind them soon, silhouetting them on the ridge. The wind gusted, catching Lan's cloak, but he assumed the Kodi once more and ignored the cold. He could hear Bukama and the other men near him breathing. Along the line, horses stamped their hooves impatiently in the snow. A hawk quartered above the open ground, hunting along the edge of the wide thicket. Suddenly the hawk wheeled away and a column of Aiel appeared, coming out of the trees at a quick trot, 20 men abreast. The snow did not appear to hamper them to any great degree. Lifting their knees high, they moved as quickly as most men would have on cleared ground. Lan pulled his looking-glass from the leather case tied to his saddle. It was a good glass, Cairhienin made, and when he pressed the brass-bound tube to his eyes, the Aiel, still a mile off, seemed to leap closer. They were tall men, many as tall as he, and some taller, wearing coats and breeches in shades of brown and gray that stood out against the snow. Each had a cloth wrapped around his head and a dark veil hiding his face to the eyes. Some might be women. Aiel women sometimes fought alongside the men, but most would be men. Each carried a short spear tipped in one hand, with a round bull-hide buckler and several more spears clutched in the other. Their bows were in cases on their backs. They could do deadly work with those spears, and their bows. The Aiel would have had to be blind to miss the horsemen waiting on them, but they came on without a pause, their column a thick serpent sliding out of the trees toward the ridge. Far to the west a trumpet sounded, thin with distance, and then another. To be that faint, they had to be near to the river, or even on the other side. The Aiel kept coming. A third trumpet called, far off, and a fourth, a fifth, more. Among the Aiel, heads swung, looking back. Was it the trumpets drew their attention, or did they know Imaris was following? The Aiel continued to issue from the trees. Someone had miscounted badly, or else more Aiel had joined the first party. Over 1,000 were clear of the trees now, and still more came. 1,500, and more behind. He slid the looking-glass back into its case. "Embrace death," Bukama muttered, sounding like cold steel, and Lan heard other borderlanders echo the words. He merely thought them. It was enough. Death came for every man eventually, and seldom where or when he expected. Of course, some men died in their beds, but from boyhood, Lan had known he would not. Calmly he looked left and right along the line of his men. The Saldaeans and Kandori were standing firm, of course, but he was pleased to see that none of the Domani showed any signs of edginess either. No one looked over his shoulder for a path to run. Not that he expected any less after 2 years fighting alongside them, but he always had more trust of men from the borderlands than elsewhere. Bordermen knew that sometimes hard choices had to be made. It was in their bones. The last of the Aiel cleared the trees, easily 2,000 of them, a number that changed everything and nothing. 2,000 Aiel were enough to overrun his men and still deal with Imaris, unless the Dark One's own luck was with them. The thought of withdrawing never arose. If Imaris struck without the anvil in place, the Tyrans would be slaughtered. But if he could hold until Imaris arrived, then both hammer and anvil might be able to draw clear. Besides, he had given his word. Still, he did not mean to die here to no purpose, nor to have his men die to none. If Imaris failed to arrive by the time the Aiel came inside 200 paces, he would wheel his company off the ridge and try to ride around the Aiel to join the Tyrant. Sliding his sword from its scabbard, he held it loosely at his side. It was just a sword now, with nothing about it to catch the eye or set it out. It would never again be anything except a sword. But it held his past and his future. The trumpets to the west were sounding almost continuously. Abruptly, one of the Aiel in the front of the column raised his spear overhead, holding it up for the length of 3 strides. When he brought it down, the column came to a halt. A good 500 paces separated them from the ridgeline, well beyond bowshot. Why, under the light? As soon as they were halted, the rear half of the column turned to face the way they had come. Were they simply being cautious? Safer to assume they knew about Imaris. Drawing out his looking-glass again, left-handed, he studied the Aiel. Men in the front rank were shading their eyes with their spear hands, studying the horsemen on the ridge. It made no sense. At best, they would be able to make out dark shapes against the sunrise, perhaps the crest on a helmet. No more than that. The Aielmen seemed to be talking to each other. One of the men in the lead suddenly raised his hand overhead, holding a spear, and others did the same. Lan lowered his looking-glass. All of the Aiel were facing forward now, and every one held a spear raised high. He had never seen anything like this before. As one, the spears came down, and the Aiel shouted a single word that boomed clearly across the space between, drowning the trumpet's distant calls. "On a line!" Lan exchanged wondering glances with Bukama. That was the old tongue, the language that had been spoken in the Age of Legends, and in the centuries before the Trolloc Wars. The best translation Lan could come up with was, "one man alone." But what did it mean? Why would the Aiel shout such a thing? "They're moving," Bukama muttered. And the Aiel were. But not toward the ridge. Turning northward, the column of veiled Aiel quickly reached a trot again, and, once the head of it was well beyond the end of the ridge, began to angle eastward once more. Madness piled on madness. This was no flanking maneuver, not only on one side. "Maybe they're going back to the waist," Kaniadrin called. He sounded disappointed. Other voices scoffed him loudly. The general view was that the Aiel would never leave until they were all killed. "Do we follow?" Bukama asked quietly. After a moment, Lan shook his head. "We will find Lord Imaris and talk, politely, concerning hammers and anvils," he said. He wanted to find out what all those trumpets were about, too. This day was beginning strangely, and he had the feeling there would be more oddities before it was done.